This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Green's iconic creature type, Hydras. Now, you might be thinking that elves are the iconic creature type for Green, and depending on what you mean by iconic, you would be right, but I'm using Wizards terminology here. According to them, iconic creature types are creatures who mostly appear at higher rarities, have huge stats, are incredibly powerful in a vacuum, and are generally something that players are very familiar with outside the realm of Magic, so that even new players will think they're really cool. If you're interested in more about these iconic creature types, Mark Rosewater wrote an article about them back in 2013 explaining more about them, and I put a link to it in the description. So where do elves fall? They are classified as a representative creature type by Wizards, meaning they are a sentient race that exemplifies a color and appears on most planes and at all rarities. So yeah, Hydras are the green iconic creature type, and that's what we will be looking at today. In all, 47 Hydras have been printed, and in this video we're going to talk about the 10 that have left the biggest mark on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's look at number 10. At number 10, it is Elvenwold Hydra. At worst, the Hydra gives you a 6 mana 7/7 with reach, which isn't terrible, but would probably not be enough for it to see play if that's all it did. Luckily for Elvenwold Hydra, it also searches your library for a land, and it can be any land, not just basic ones. This means it can help you fix your mana in a multicolor deck, but it can also search up powerful non-basic lands. While it was in Standard, it was played in both Ramp and Temur Aetherworks Marvel decks. In both cases, it could search up nice multicolored lands, but also Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, which could help you ramp even more than normal. It has never seen play outside of Standard, and that's not going to change anytime soon. At number 9, it's Ancient Hydra, which is the oldest card to make the list. It is also the only Hydra on the list which is not at least part green. So, the Hydra might not seem like much today. I mean, it's a 5 mana 5/1 with the downside of fading. And yeah, that is kind of rough, but being able to turn those fading counters into damage against anything is pretty nice. The Hydra can easily get a 2-for-1 thanks to that ability. What's more is, while it was in Standard, fading creatures could get some extra power thanks to Fires of Yavimaya. Because it gives your whole board haste, it meant that fading creatures could get in an additional attack before fading out of existence. And a 5/1 with haste that your opponent isn't expecting is pretty nice, especially with all the other value the Hydra gives you. All 6 of Ancient Hydra's points came in Standard at Pro Tour Chicago in 2000, where it appeared in 3 Fires of Yavimaya decks that made the top 8. At number 8, it is Mana Gorger Hydra. This Hydra can get massive in a hurry, and if your opponent doesn't deal with it, you're going to have a huge creature with trample in play, and you'll have only spent 3 mana on it. While it was in Standard, it was extra potent in Hardened Scales decks, which made it so that the Hydra got big even faster. Earlier this year, the Hydra started being played in Vintage. Vintage is a format loaded up with cheap and free spells, and that means the Hydra can get huge in a hurry. This is especially true in Paradoxical Outcome decks, which can chain tons of spells together. Some versions of that deck run a singleton copy of the Hydra as a potential win condition, though the primary way to win the game for those decks does tend to be using a card with Storm, but the Hydra gives the deck a way to win without having to rely on that. It looks like this Hydra will be gaining more points in Vintage in the future. At number 7, it's Mistcutter Hydra, the kind of creature that gives a big middle finger to blue decks. He can't be countered, comes with protection from blue, and has haste, all things that are a pretty big problem for blue decks. There are several Hydras in the game with X in their mana cost, and also several that do stuff with plus and +1 counters, and Mistcutter Hydra does both of those things. While it was in Standard, one of the best decks around was Devotion to Blue, and this Hydra was a great sideboard card against those decks, since it couldn't interact with it in any way or block it, since literally everything in Devotion to Blue decks was, well, blue. The Hydra hasn't been a good enough color hoser to see play outside of Standard, but I think it has an outside shot at being successful in Pioneer, depending on how the metagame develops there. At number 6, it's Genesis Hydra. Fun fact, Genesis Hydra was a card designed by the creator of Plants vs. Zombies, George Fan. That's why this Hydra has a plant creature type. Anyway, Genesis Hydra is a really cool card and a great place to sink a bunch of mana. It gives you a massive creature and a Genesis Wave effect that has a good chance of putting something else into play for free, depending on how much mana you spend on it. 2 cards for the price of 1 is always great, and that's what you'll be getting here. The good news for Genesis Hydra too is that it existed in a standard where devotion was one of the best things you could do, in no small part thanks to Nykthos, Shrine of Nyx. That land could really make sure you ended up with a ton of mana and allowed you to cast some pretty impressive Genesis Hydras. Genesis Hydra was one of the best reasons to go the green devotion route, and it found considerable success while it wasn't standard. At number 5, it's Progenitors. One of the most powerful creatures in the entire game, at least in a vacuum. Progenitors is almost impossible to deal with if it ever comes into play because it has protection from everything. Obviously, it has an incredibly difficult mana cost, but the decks it has appeared in over the years get around that by cheating it into play. There weren't any good ways to do that in either standard or block, and as a result, it was never played in either format. In Extended, it was used in Hypergenesis decks, a deck that would ultimately have to get banned out of existence. Legacy is where Progenitors has picked up 12 of its 17 points. In that format, Progenitors has been cheated into play using cards like Natural Order, Sneak Attack, and Show and Tell. It hasn't picked up any points in the last several years, but it is difficult to ever count out a creature as powerful as Progenitors. At number 4, we have Voracious Hydra, a card that's still in Standard. Voracious Hydra is great because it can either give you a highly efficient creature with Trample, or it can function as a removal spell, which still gives you a creature with Trample, but generally a much less impressive one. Still, a creature that scales as the game goes on and is highly flexible about when you play it on the curve, and can work as a removal spell when it needs to, is pretty powerful. For a while in Standard, green was hands down the strongest color, thanks to the presence of cards like Oko and Veil of Autumn, among other things. Voracious Hydra went along for the ride, seeing play in lots of Simic Food, Simic Ramp, and Simic Control decks. I think the Hydra has a good chance at continuing to find success, despite the fact that both Oko and the Veil are now banned. At number 3, we have a legendary Hydra, Pulu, World Eater. He gives you some nice stats. A 4-mana 5/5 is no joke, but what pushed him into being one of the better creatures of his time was his monstrosity ability. It might be mana intensive, but man, it can really wreck your opponent's board state while also making him even bigger. And hey, like Genesis Hydra, Pulu was in Theros Standard, where devotion decks were incredibly strong, so producing enough mana to pump into that ability wasn't as far-fetched as it would be in most formats. Pulu probably has an outside shot of finding success in Pioneer going forward. At number 2, it's Bristling Hydra. The Hydra utilizes what might be Magic's most broken mechanic, at least in recent history, and that's energy. Like most creatures who use energy, the Hydra brings some with it, and in this case, you can use the energy to make the Hydra permanently larger and give it hexproof until end of turn. That ability can be a real nightmare to play against, because players can of course use it at instant speed, thus nullifying whatever removal spell you try to cast on it. You basically had to use 2 removal spells to kill the thing. This gets even scarier when decks had other ways to make energy, and they all did, in which case you couldn't even use 2 removal spells to kill it. It was a key card in the various energy decks that really dominated Standard in 2017, and after some of the key cards in that deck got banned, it still found some success in black-green Constrictor decks, which were more focused on +1/+1 counters and less focused on energy. And at number 1, it's Hydroid Crassus, which is a Jellyfish Hydra beast. This card was hugely hyped when it was revealed, since it is an absolutely stupid win condition for control decks. If a control deck resolves this against you in the late game, you're not going to be winning, since they restock their hand, gain some life, and play a win condition, all with 1 card. And the fact it has X in its cost means you can always run it out there earlier, if you need to, and sometimes you do. A 4-mana 2/2 that gains you 1 life and draws you a card is pretty good, even if it isn't as busted as some other options. The Crassus was seeing a ton of play in Standard, even before the arrival of Oko basically made blue-green decks unbeatable. Before Oko, Hydroid Crassus was played primarily in Bant and Sultai control decks. Then, when Oko was around, the Crassus was one of the key cards in the deck, and now that Oko is banned, the Crassus is still seeing play. In fact, it made it to number 1 on this list by virtue of appearing in 4 of the top 8 decks at Mythic Championship 7, which was held last weekend. These days, it is being played in Simic and Sultai Ramp and Simic and Sultai Flash decks. The Crassus may only have recently taken the number 1 spot on this list, but it is going to just keep adding to its score until it rotates out of Standard, and it's hard to imagine any card ever catching it. The fact that it's already at number 1 in this list and still has a lot of time left in Standard is pretty impressive. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this list, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see the MTG Top 10s from the past, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.